Good. Welcome to today's webinar on GACP for cannabis and hemp workflows. I've got on our show today Ross McPhail, who is going to present for us. And Ross, welcome to the show. Essentially, I know you quite well in the industry as someone who's involved with getting several licenses approved for medical cannabis licensing with SAHPRA. And I think what I'd like to do today is firstly welcome Ross to our audience.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Absolute pleasure. We're going to have a long discussion kicking into this, but I want to get us just started. So we're going to focus really a lot on GACP today, good agricultural and collection practices. And we've discussed analytics in the past, quality control considerations for cannabis and hemp, as well as extraction and processing. But today we're going to look at and review licensing and who's responsible in South Africa, from SAHPRA, the medical regulator, all the way to the Department of Agriculture, the types of licenses that are out there and the differences and distinctions. We'll discuss briefly the World Health Organization's view on good agricultural and collection practices and GAP in general, or good agricultural practices. And then our discussion is really going to kick into that seed to cell supply, SOPs that surround that space, as well as common pitfalls that individuals like Ross will see when they're visiting, and how to get ready for an audit from the medical regulator. And I think let's maybe jump into this point. Ross, what is your view on SAHPRA's role and ultimately the Department of Agriculture's role when it comes to approving, let's use the traditional medicinal cannabis licenses, Section 22C1B, and if you can tell us, perhaps, because that is the more common commercial type of medical license, if you can tell us SAHPRA's role and Department of Agriculture's role, as you see it.
All right. Well, yeah, SAHPRA, obviously the South African Health Products Regulating Authority. They are regulating the entire cannabis industry in terms of the medicinal entity. So they're looking, well, we actually refer to a Section 22C1B, which is Act 101 of 1965 of the Medicines Act. So SAHPRA's got two different formats. They've got their inspectorate and their directorate, and these are the guys that are responsible for regulating cannabis and obviously doing the requirements and regulations around cannabis production, as well as cultivating. Then Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. They were issuing hemp licenses at some point, or hemp permits, I should say. Yeah, as of what's happening with those hemp permits, I'm not too sure right now. I know that a few of them are coming up for expiry, but there's a few that are out there. And that's obviously just research and development. And then Department of Agriculture is also involved in the importation or supplying of seeds.
Yes, that's correct. So that's the way I see it, as well as agriculture looking to take over more on the GAP or GACP side, and obviously SAHPRA's role is usually traditionally for medical containing products and their dosage forms, where we've seen updates as in terms of the rescheduling back on the 23rd of May around THC to Schedule 6 and CBD to 4, as well as Schedule 0 under specification. I want to also mention some additional license formats, because I've sat often in meetings where there's a bit of confusion around what permits and licenses, and what's a permit and what's a license. Obviously, a Section 21 application that a doctor would do would be for specific or cannabinoid containing medication, where maybe a marketing authorization is not available or registered in the country. So that would be something where a doctor would look to prescribe something, and there's only a couple, I think it was 60, 70, perhaps more patients that have that type of application. In terms of the hemp research permits, this relates more to the 22A9AI. Yeah, this is, again, Ross, in terms of commercialization scope for the research permit. I mean, the grounds for this was really to start getting research around the plant established. And, we are waiting to hear more from agriculture in terms of updates around what the future, or let's call it 2021, will look like in terms of permitting and licensing. But essentially, the scope there is really on research, and I know there's a bit of a issue going around with SAPs and the Hawks, and everyone's looking at these permits more closely. And you mentioned that expiry. How long are these permits valid for?
Well, look, the few that I've seen, I think they were valid for a year.
Yep.
So yeah, I haven't seen an extension on them yet. I haven't seen if the guys can actually extend them as of yet as well. But from what I know, in a discussion that we had with SAPRA a while ago on one of the webinars, was that the hemp research permits were now getting reversed, so taken away. And obviously now the Section 22C is what you would need to apply for. So a lot of the guys were doing research and development. So what they were allowed to do was obviously research how cannabis worked with regards to seeds, cultivating, and then obviously after that they would need to destroy the product.
Okay, good. And obviously, agriculture is looking to take over hemp licensing, is what we understand from some of the communication prior. So that role is, I understand it as SAPRA is not issuing these types of permits, and the intent would be for agriculture to issue these permits, where SAPRA would, however, still continue to issue permits on cultivation for 22C1B, as well as GMP extraction under 22C1B. So that's all in alignment from my end as well. So let's jump ahead. And a good question I've always had is, in terms of regulating, what is SAPRA using as their baseline? We know they have mentioned specifically the WHO, the World Health Organization guidelines on good agricultural and collection practices for medicinal plants. Where this is also linked, there's quite a lot of information out there in terms of also the European Medical Agency's evaluation around GACP on medicinal plants. I've also seen publications from Europam, which has a nice GACP working group, and also the American Herbal Products Association, where they've also had GACP standards out there for the US primarily and probably Canada. But now the question has always been in terms of how SAPRA views it. We're going to dig in perhaps today into, what you're commonly seen in terms of SOPs, the site master files, what is being chosen from the different regs and how is it being applied and viewed, and how harmonized is that between regulators? Because ideally there's a consistency and a standard around how GACP is being enforced, which would obviously form the basis of consistent licensing. For anyone out there who obviously says, well, look, cannabis is cannabis, what's with all these regulations when it comes to the actual cultivation? I mean, the primary point is to mitigate risk to the consumer. I saw some good webinars recently where a good example was bottled water. You can't just go and bottle water yourself and sell it at Clicks or at Spa and just put your own label on it. There's standards and this is important. At the end of the day, whether it's medical grade for export, whether it is dietary supplement for CBD wellness, whether it's a possible recreational framework, all of these tests and all of these standards are there to protect the consumer. And this is often where there's a bit of a disparity between deregulation, complete deregulation, and standards. We obviously come from a standpoint where certain regulations need to be in place to protect the consumer, and obviously different regulations need to apply to pharmaceutical, CBD wellness, and recreational, if that were to happen in this country. So again, mitigating risks like heavy metals, pesticides, detrimental microbes, aflatoxin, that's really what the point of standards are. And for us, we're going to jump ahead to what I would like to hold on, which is an open discussion. What I'd like to discuss is everything from seed to sale, the scope for SOPs around that, and then Ross will share a lot on that with us, as well as common pitfalls when visiting sites. But before we get into some of these bullet points, let me ask the obvious question, Ross, which is, I've heard often, how do we get... So let's go back to the license. What is the first thing you need to do when you're applying for Section 22C1B to get your first audit from SAPRA?
Well, look, obviously there's a whole process that needs to happen. So there's a quality management system that needs to be in place, as well as your standard operating procedures. You've got your validation protocols, your validation reports, you've got your self-inspection audits. So there's really a whole bunch of paperwork that all needs to be tied in here. And this forms part of your quality manual. So with pharmacy, obviously you need a quality manual in order to do pharmaceutical. At the end of the day, cannabis is an API, which is an active pharmaceutical ingredient. So you need to adhere to SAPRA's guidelines in order to do that. But pretty much when you start off, you'll start with your site master file. You'll need to get a basic site plan of what you're actually going to be doing that conforms to the regulations set out by SAPRA. And then your license application at the end of the day. That's what, in essence, gets you going. So when a lot of guys approach compliance agencies, I mean, what happens is they kind of want this shell of what needs to happen. So they think that all you need is a piece of land and you're ready to go. With SAPRA, it's a little bit different. You need to have a working model available for them to actually come and inspect you. And that's where a lot of guys get confused. So if you are looking to get into the cannabis space, just keep in mind that you need to have a facility up and running and able to validate something like 12 pots of tomatoes, for example, but including having a processing facility that can actually process cannabis in the suitable way that you're going to be processing an active pharmaceutical ingredient.
Okay, good. And let me distinguish there, because I think this is one point where Lesotho is very different to South Africa, is that licenses obviously issued there without, let's say, a mandated inspection linked to a site. And I think this is an important point to discuss, because essentially, usually what needs to be on site for that first audit. So before once you've done your application and you've, let's maybe step back and say, if we're filing and submitting paperwork for application, acknowledgement of receipt of application, how does that work? Obviously, there's some guidelines on SAPRA's website about what to be completed. You obviously assist from a compliance standpoint in completing that documentation and then building out the QMS documents, the quality management system. And then obviously the understanding also is that every site is different. So as much as you might have an initial QMS packet, you would need to obviously develop that to your site's SOPs and how big your site facility is and your specifics. But how, in terms of a framework, once, let's say they've started with the compliance documentation, what do they need for their first audit to be ready?
Well, look, obviously they need their cultivation space up. So whatever you have ready for SAPRA to inspect is what you'll receive a license on. So they'll come through, they'll do an inspection. So it all depends on the growing system as well. I mean, you get hydroponics, aeroponics, aquaponics, manual feeding, drip feed irrigation. So it all also depends on what type of framework you're using to do cultivation as well. And then this all forms part of your standard operating procedures as well. So yeah, we'll start customizing according to what you're doing at site. And then obviously tie in all the documents or the documentation to actually speak to what's happening with your site master file. So in essence, your site master file is basically an overview of what your facility is going to be doing. And then SAPRA comes and validates what you've explained to them in your site master file. And then they do your inspection. And based on the inspection, you'll either be given a list of deficiencies where we would need to do a response in order to get to licensing. But yeah, they keep it open for about 30 days until you give another response, and then another 30 days till you give another response, and another 30 days till you get another response. So in terms of them or SAPRA coming out again, it depends. If it's a critical finding, then they'll obviously need to come out and re-inspect. If it's minors, then obviously you can show them in video recordings or photos or proof of purchases or validation that you have managed to complete what their deficiency list was.
Okay, good, excellent. That's quite nice and comprehensive there. In terms of personal experience, because at the end of the day, you've been onto a lot of different sites, and I'd like to always ask, what seems to be a very popular approach towards the cultivation format? You mentioned, aeroponics, hydroponics, drip, etc. What do you see working in terms of not just the feed, but also obviously in terms of the lighting? How many are indoor? How does it look in terms of greenhouses? If you can maybe give us some insights there, what seems to be working for the South African climate is perhaps the question I'm going for.
Look, it's very hard to say. Obviously, you get some guys that have an understanding of cultivation, and you get some guys that are obviously business investors that are coming into this as well. So in terms of what everyone's going for, it's relatively open-ended. I mean, I've been to sites where there's a hydroponic system up. I've seen indoor facilities. I've seen greenhouses. I've seen tunnels. So it all also boils down to your budget at the end of the day. I mean, you can get a greenhouse that's top of the range, that has light deprivation, evap cooling, temperature control, HVAC systems. Then you've got a tunnel, which is obviously it's not really open to the elements, but you haven't really got a cooling element to it. So I mean, you're cultivating in the heat in essence. So yeah, it all depends on your budget. I mean, you can do a basic license facility where you can do a tunnel with your processing facility, and then you get the high-end guys that are obviously doing indoor hydroponic feeds with 1,000-watt Kavita lights, but it all depends on the growing space as well. I mean, obviously putting up a building it's an expensive procedure. So yeah, a lot of the guys are turning to greenhouses, even in the middle of the range greenhouses, and that seems to be working mostly, eh? Because then with that, you're allowed to do drip feeding, or you can do hydroponics, or you can do hand feeding. So it's all based on your cultivation expert at the end of the day as well.
Good, perfect. And I think also a big impact is your offtake, because if you're specifically aiming for, let's say, a very high EU-GMP type of offtake that's specifically for German markets, the guys there are more familiar, perhaps with the Canadian and the Bedrocan formats, which are indoor. And it's taking them some time to get familiar with the GACP approach that's common, let's say, across South America, Australia, and Africa, where we have good natural light and, not as harsh a winter in the southern hemisphere. So those are the things that I think evolves the space and develops the space, where really the intent behind all of it is just to get a consistent and stable cultivation of a product that can serve as a botanical API, leading into, or from a botanical origin into an API. And I think that kind of addresses it as well, because I think if you look at that, you get to see it. In terms of questions I had for you, in terms of, I'm looking here at a couple of the questions I'd written down. Often the things come up like you need a letter of an offtake before you actually get a license. That's a requirement of SAPRA, correct?
Yes, yeah, SAPRA requires a letter of intent. So yeah, you need to have something in place in order for them to validate that you've got a client.
Perfect, 100%. And then in terms of the site master files, you've mentioned you helping, assisting, putting that together. There's been a lot of discussion about the responsible person required for the site, whether that person's ad hoc, locum, full-time. Are there any updates we're seeing there around, it's a bit of a debate and it's going back and forth. We've discussed this in the past as well, whether or not you need a full-time responsible person. Any comments on that?
Yeah, look, so with cannabis, we talk about an authorized representative. This is the person that's responsible with speaking to SAPRA and obviously engaging with SAPRA in recalls or reprocessing, or even in changing key personnel. So that's where your authorized person comes in, or your authorized representative, which you guys would know as your responsible person. But there's also talks now about actually having a responsible pharmacist on site as well. There's obviously still talks going back and forward as to what length this is going to happen, because I mean, obviously if you look at it at a cultivation site, I mean, if you've got a tunnel, you're only going to grow once, maybe 1.5 times a year. So there's no point to having a pharmacist on site 24/7 when you're only going to be handling the active pharmaceutical ingredient twice a year max. So yeah, when you start moving up to greenhouses or even perpetual growing, then you're doing 4 to 6 to 8 grows a year. Then you can actually substantiate having a pharmacist on site, because then you're going to be constantly packing, weighing, and validating that you have that amount of cannabis on site.
Yeah, and I think this is something, obviously, it's difficult because the traditional framework is a Section 22C1B, which would require a responsible pharmacist on site for that premises. And I think trying to merge these two is a challenge, especially because if you consider it has to be a full-time responsible pharmacist, then the barrier to entry keeps going up. And we've noticed that there's been quite a strong political push for lowering the barrier to entry. We've obviously addressed things like the hemp space and the CBD wellness space, trying to remove that or, separate that to some extent from the medical export market. And I think these are the type of issues that really need to be addressed in discussions, is that difference between the different grades we're talking about. So let's talk a bit about SOPs. In terms of getting started, I mean, a lot of people out there, I guess one of the most frustrating points you have is people not understanding, what's all this documentation, when you need an SOP, everything you do, you need to write it down. So can you maybe talk us through your main SOPs that you need to consider when you're looking to obviously get an application approved by SAPRA? if you can take us through that picking list, of essentially from seed all the way through to final labeling, just touch on it and let's call it a 4-minute or 5-minute monologue so that people out there can kind of know what to start asking you about.
Look, well, I mean, in terms of standard operating procedures, I mean, you're talking about 2,000 pages worth of documentation. So for someone to sit there and try and write all of these themselves is going to take them a long, long time, But yeah, I mean, if you look at your critical processes, I mean, you've got your drying, you've got your curing, you've got your trimming, you've got your weighing and packing, and then obviously your finished goods store. So, I mean, all of these tie into obviously good manufacturing practices when you start getting into that scope of things. But yeah, so from your cultivation space, you'll follow good agricultural practices. So you'll have a way that you obviously grow. How do you do mothering? What is your administration of nutrients? Then do you grow from seeds? Do you grow from tissue culture or rooted plants? Yeah, then obviously cloning is another thing like I just touched on. And then harvesting, vegging, flowering. I mean, all of those fall under good agricultural practices. But I mean, once it exits your greenhouse or your indoor cultivation facility and it goes into your processing facility where you're going to weigh it and then enter your drying room, I mean, that's when you start talking about good manufacturing practices, and that's where you're obviously starting to handle the active pharmaceutical ingredient. So there's a lot of standard operating procedures involved. I mean, you don't exactly want to run around, especially as a CEO, and start delegating and talking to people and explaining these processes over and over and over again, when all you really have to do is have a standard operating procedure that explains it to the person in a readable format in English that he can understand and practice his position of what he actually needs to do inside the cultivation space or even in the processing facility.
Perfect. And I think that addresses the question I had up here on the slide deck, which is, where does GACP stop and GMP start? You've addressed that well in terms of, exiting the greenhouse and going into your, that's something that I also think gets addressed within the different guidelines we referred to previously and is on the slide deck as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stop sharing because I'm going to pull us up onto full screen mode, because this will then basically have us a little more visually in the camera because we're on the same slide deck, and I'll share our details at the end again for us. But for me, that's interesting. In terms of traceability, that's a big one. Do you want to talk us through traceability from things like what happens with seeds? If we take seeds from I know it's different for tissue culture and seeds, but let's address seeds quickly. How does the process work in terms of bringing seeds in? What happens in the workflow from import, which I assume is where most of the seeds obviously are coming from, till the point where they're put into the ground? And then how does traceability look once they're in the ground till they're in the final labeled product?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, everything throughout the world right now is working from license holder to license holder. So this is the same case with seeds. At the end of the day, it's a cannabinoid, so it's a cannabis containing medicine. So you would still need to follow through the license procedure. So you would need to gain an import permit once you've got a license, and then obviously you can bring your seeds in. Now that's where the tracking actually starts. So obviously you've purchased your seeds. Now you're going to capture them into your receiving area, and then they'll get dispersed out to your cultivation facility. So once those seeds literally get sold to you, that's when the tracking starts. So now you need to plant them. Now you need to do batch coding. So you have to have a batch identification number, strain number, and then obviously it follows. So, I mean, you're going to start going into your veg cycle, then into your flowering cycle. Unless you want to start doing, then you'll choose the strongest plants out of the veg cycle and put those into a mother room. And then you'll start taking clones from those. So anything that happens in terms of the cannabis, you need to obviously track. So when it starts becoming mother plants, then you'll get a batch code according to the mother plant and then how many cuttings were taken from her and planted into the soil. Same thing with moving into your processing facility. So now you need to weigh your wet material, take it into your drying room and see what your loss of drying specification is. And then obviously start moving through those processes, drying, curing, trimming, weighing and packing. I mean, by the time you've taken a wet, full biomass of plant, and now you've dried it, cured it, and trimmed it, I mean, you're going to get a very different reading to dried material as what you did with wet. So obviously everything needs to be recorded because most of this, the offcuts or the wastage, needs to be sent to your destruction area, and that's where it'll get sent for destruction, which has to be recorded by a pharmacist.
Yeah, and that's where they come in on site again, the RP. So perfect, 100%. And then in terms of That's also addresses where agriculture is really involved when it comes to these SAPRA licenses, because they really kind of take a direct involvement on the importation and permission on the seeds. Have you seen any kind of quarantines around seeds that are being applied when they come in before they get the special site?
Yeah, personally, I haven't seen it, but I know that it gets sent off to a holding area before it gets cleared. And then, yeah, it'll get sent to your facility once the clearance has happened and Port Health or SAPRA is happy with it, as well as Department of Agriculture, and then you'll receive your seeds.
Perfect. And if you were to bring in, let's say, clones or tissue culture, or bringing in even mother plants, do you have any insight into that approach?
Look, mother plants, you probably could get your hands on mother plants if it's from a licensed facility. Obviously, no one's done the exercise yet, but in terms of clones, you're also allowed to bring in clones. Yeah, I'm just not entirely sure of the process around what happens. I'm not sure if it gets sent straight to site or if it also needs to go to quarantine. Obviously, with it being a rooted plant, it would have a lifespan that you would need to get it to a facility as quick as possible. So you would need to get it into the ground in order to carry on cultivating. So
perfect. And I mean, I think that part of this is like this should actually be outlined by agriculture in detail, because often I find that compliance and individuals in the, let's say, traditional pharmaceutical space or the compliance space are trying to figure these things out by themselves in pockets, instead of this actually being well documented and published. And this is why there's this need for continuous communication between the different governmental agencies and everyone else that's facilitating the process, because this really should be written down, clearly defined, clearly elaborated, is for this type of material, these are the approaches, this is how it should be done. But I digressed a little, so let me pull back into things around offtakes. This is a nice one as well. So let's say I've now gone through that whole permission cycle. I've gotten my seeds or my rooted material. I've started, let's say I've got my mothers that I've cultivated, I've cut, and I've done my cloning in. And now I'm starting to get plants that have gone from veg to flower, and I'm keeping my mothers aside. And you're the cultivation guy, I'm more the extraction, GMP, and analytical guy. But essentially, at that point, once I'm now harvesting a flowered batch, what are the critical quality control aspects you've seen? And then how does the approach look in terms of the export of that product?
Well, look, obviously you would need to take it into your drying processing. So it would have to go through to your drying, your curing, your trimming, your weighing and packing. But everything involves a certificate of analysis. So product's ready. Obviously your off-taker will then give you spec sheets, so specifications on how you need to grow your product. First of all, that's the number one priority, because in essence you're supplying your client. So you would obviously need to get a COA, so that would validate what you've grown up to the specifications of your offtake, and then obviously share that COA with your client, and as well as your export permit. And then if the COA is good to go, then you're more than welcome to send your product overseas.
Okay, excellent. And I mean, we've had discussions on offtakes in the past, and the other thing is, I know I've asked SAPRA about the INCB export limits as well, but they've assured me that that's easy. So let's hope that is true. I know that sometimes, getting clarity on that is a little difficult in terms of those kind of considerations. I pulled up the slide deck again. Because we're kind of, I think, coming to a close, because I do think what we'll do is we're going to have some more granular discussions, and I'm sure if there are comments and questions, please feel free to reach out to us in this regard, so that we can kind of have some good questions and Q&A for the next sessions. But I think today's objective was to really start talking around GACP, what clients entering the game for the first time need to know and consider. And I've included Ross's details attached here, and myself. I've done some webinars in the past on overview of cannabis quality considerations, especially when we're looking towards export in the EU market. So using some examples of companies like Bedrocan, what they are using in terms of the Dutch monograph, in terms of quality considerations. Perhaps not always applicable if you're looking at tertiary markets from that point. I've also discussed GMP on the extraction processing side. It's really something that I feel needs to be addressed within regulation, is that difference between dietary supplement grade and pharmaceutical grade. I don't like to use the term medicinal grade because often medicinal grade is used loosely in the US. So when we talk about dietary supplement, we talk about CBD wellness, and when we talk about pharmaceutical grade, we're talking about the 210, 211 CFRs from the FDA versus the dietary supplement, which is 111, and food, which is 110. But we're going to have a lot of discussions on infused products, edibles, the regulatory landscape for that, I'm sure, in the future, Ross. And extraction is definitely my base passion. So always interested in the extraction discussion and the analytics discussion. But I think at this point, I'm going to exit on the slideshow and stop sharing on my end. And in terms of closing comments, let me stop sharing and bring you back up, Ross. What are some of the most common, I suppose you get people when it's almost too late at times. You're fortunate, I suppose, if you get clients that come to you early, from the beginning in that regard. I often, because I'm on the back end, which is on the manufacturing, the extraction platform side, I tend to also have to understand the upstream a lot more. What are some of the problems you see that guys just overlook from the start? I notice people don't like to read. I suppose that's one of them. There's quite a lot of, if I'm going to spend 10 or 100 million Rand on a facility, I like to do my research, meet with as many opinionated professionals as possible, and make an informed decision. What do you see typically as the pitfalls that clients often have and that you often are addressing?
Well, look, I mean, in terms of SAPRA, I mean, you've got safety, security, and efficacy. So obviously, security is a massive factor when it comes to SAPRA. So obviously, securing the building, making sure that your electric fences are up, cameras. I mean, cameras is a massive thing. And not just that, I mean, if you guys want help to get licensed, come to the professionals, come to the guys that know what they're doing. That way you won't have extra expenses. You won't feel like you've been duped out of millions of rands. I mean, at the end of the day, professionals help professionals. So if you come to us, we can assist you with all your application details. So everything from the beginning, literally we hold your hand from A to Z of the entire process. So that way you won't need to worry about anything. But yeah, in terms of your question, I mean, there's a lot of guys that they'll obviously start building a facility because they're friends in construction. And then when you actually get to a site, you're like, guys, there's no pharmaceutical flow. There's no flow on how the product's going to get regulated. I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about cross-contamination and managing risk, mitigating risk. Risk is a massive factor when it comes to pharmaceutical products, and especially with security and safety. So yeah, just get in touch with us and let us assist you.
Perfect. I like your closing statement, which is professionals help professionals, which is something I can relate to. Is I like these professional conversations, and I appreciate you making time for us to actually have this type of a conversation in this format, because I often find silos within the industry. And one thing I'm often pushing for is just adequate sharing of information. Not everything is always accurate, because sometimes we are reliant on, like I mentioned with agriculture, like needing to have clear understanding of, how certain materials are going to be handled, imported, exported. And unless that's all documented clearly, it leaves room for interpretation. And I think this is where room for interpretation is the devil in the detail, often in South Africa. And for me, just these type of sessions, these discussions, for those out there viewing it, I encourage you to keep viewing these type of webinars, and I will definitely push with Ross and others out there to get as much content to the public domain so that you can make an informed decision. At the end of the day, that's ultimately what we need. Is we need more individuals like yourself, Ross, that are willing to come onto these platforms, have a discussion, share, that knowledge with the industry, so that we can all kind of get to a point where we understand and feel we understand what is required, so that guys don't sit in the hole. I often sit with anywhere from traditional healers saying the plant should be open for everyone to, that approach where the pharmaceutical industry is only going to win. But I see the pharmaceutical industry, also some of the individuals out there struggling because they've taken so long to get licenses done. And we've got a golden opportunity to get it right in South Africa. So thank you, Ross. I appreciate your time. I'm going to put in a stop to our webinar now, ultimately on my end, and I'm looking forward to our next session.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Cool. Pleasure.
Keep safe.
Thanks for your time. Okay, cheers. Bye.
Cheers.